Hello, my name is Ted Sod. I'm the education dramaturg for Roundabout Theater Company in New York City. And today we are creating a remote theater talk for Sinclair Lewis's 1935 novel made into a play. The novel is entitled It Can't Happen Here, as is the play. And joining me all the way from Maine is my colleague, Leah Reddy. Hi, Leah.
Hi, Ted. How are you doing today?
So far, so good. You know, a little bit of high blood pressure because of what's going on, but we'll not talk about that. Let's talk about this particular Prussian novel of Sinclair Lewis, written in 1935, often considered a dystopian satire. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with it. I also think it has realism to it, and many critics have said the same.
Let's talk about the man himself who wrote this piece, because the generative work is what allows all the other artists, designers, actors, directors to do their work. Harry Sinclair Lewis was born in 1885. He was the youngest of three sons. His father, Edwin, was a country doctor. He comes from a family of country doctors. His grandfather was one, his father was one, his eldest brother was one, and he writes quite a bit in some of his more popular novels about the profession. Lewis himself was somewhat of a misfit. First of all, you need to understand that his mother died of tuberculosis, Emma, when he was 6. His father remarried a woman named Isabel. He had a nice relationship with his stepmother, although supposedly occasionally they would get on each other's nerves, and he would refer to her as my stepmother. He was tall. He was gangly. He was not athletic. He was stricken with a bad case of acne. He had flaming red hair, and he read voraciously. In 1903, he went to Yale after preparing for Yale at Oberlin. He started by writing for magazines. I think you told me he wrote for Cosmopolitan, which at that point was not considered a ladies' magazine, quote unquote. He wrote some potboiler novels, romances that were not very popular in the teens. And then in the 20s, he hits pay dirt with Main Street. It sells a lot of copies and surprises everybody. Do you want to talk about his work in the 20s, since those are really important years for his output?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing that's interesting about Sinclair Lewis is that many people say his work is not read or studied as much anymore because it's so much of its time. It's so much of the 1920s. But looking at it today, I actually think that's not true. It feels very relevant, and many of his themes still feel very present. So, Main Street is his first big breakthrough novel. He writes about a young woman named Carol who is college educated, marries a country doctor in a place called Gopher Prairie, Minnesota, which is based on his hometown of Sauk Center, Minnesota. And she has all these grand ideas about bringing art and culture and beauty to this small town. And her idealism runs up against the provincialism, the hypocrisy, the being content with mediocrity of the small town. Now, he's definitely satirizing the small town folks, but he also satirizes Carol in a sense because she's a dreamer and a thinker, less of a doer. She seems to have a little bit of a savior complex. He follows that up with a novel in 1922 called Babbitt, which deals with a 46-year-old businessman from a fictional city called Zenith in a fictional state called Winnemac, which is adjacent to all of the Middle West, as they were known at the time, states, Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, Michigan. And it's basically this businessman's midlife crisis. He is a successful realtor. He goes about his life doing everything he's supposed to do in his sort of complacent, very big on boosting his city sort of way. He eventually feels that's kind of empty and becomes a bohemian, but he can't really fully commit, so he goes back to his old life. And it's very much about this one man's quest for individualism versus doing what everyone else is doing. And it actually was so popular that the word Babbitt came into the lexicon to describe a middle-aged man, a businessman, who goes along with everything that people in his social set do, which I thought was very interesting considering that the term Karen has entered our current lexicon. After Babbitt, he follows it up with, in 1925, a book called Aerosmith, which deals with the life of a doctor who starts as a country doctor. And this is important to say, he really gets into the research on his books. He works with a science writer on this one. So it's very much about the medical establishment, the shortcomings of it, one man's sort of struggles to fit in and to do what's both scientifically ethical and right. And he wins the Pulitzer Prize for that, but he declines it because he thought he should have won back in 1920, 1921 for Main Street. After Aerosmith, he writes in 1927 a novel called Elmer Gantry, which is very much about a Billy Sunday, Amy Semple McPherson, somewhat hypocritical minister. And to write this, he spent a bunch of time with a bunch of different ministers in Kansas City. And then he finishes out with a book called Dodsworth about a businessman, again from Zenith and Winnemac, and his somewhat younger wife, and their marriage sort of dissolving as they go to Europe after the businessman's retirement. So he writes very much about the Middle West, middle class of the 1920s. And in 1930, he wins the Nobel Prize for Literature, which he accepts. And in his acceptance speech, he says, "In America, most of us, not readers alone, but even writers, are still afraid of any literature which is not a glorification of everything American, a glorification of our faults as well as our virtues." I encourage anyone, you can find this speech online, look it up and read it because he's really spot on.
And artists often are the ones who allow us to see ourselves, hold the mirror up. They're sometimes 5 years ahead of everybody else. Mm-hmm. I love the fact that you mentioned he won. He was the first American to win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1930, because he also said at that point, this will be the end of me. And in many ways, it was. The 30s, the 40s, he dies in 1951, probably of a heart ailment brought on by his profound alcoholism. We should mention that he was married twice. His first marriage ended because he had an affair. The second marriage was to a woman named Dorothy Thompson, who was a reporter and covered fascism, specifically in Germany, until she was expelled by Hitler. And she was feeding him information about the rise of fascist governments, and it inspired the novel on which today's radio play is based. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the 1935 novel. Not only was he thinking about the rise of fascism in Europe at the time, he was also very interested in the rise of the popularity of the demagogue Huey Long in Louisiana. This novel from 1935 was considered very prescient and still is, because it sort of tracks the rise of a demagogue in this country. And the title says it all. It can't happen here, or can it? It sort of takes Huey Long's relationship with a clergyman named Father Coughlin, who was beating the drum for Long, and creates two characters sort of modeled on them. The demagogue in It Can't Happen Here is Buzz Windrip, and he says all the right things. He's somewhat crass, and he tells the populace that he's going to give them money, $5,000 each, and then after he wins the popular vote, he starts to systematically destroy democracy. Now, this novel proved very popular because of what was going on, not only in America and Louisiana, but in Europe at the same time. And it immediately became a play version, which Lewis worked on with a man named John C. Moffat. Would you tell our listeners about this too, please?
Absolutely. So the play was done in 1936 as part of the Federal Theater Project. And to rewind just a little bit, the Federal Theater Project was started the year before, 1935, as part of the Works Progress Administration, which was an effort to put out-of-work Americans back to work. In this case, it included all of the theater artisans, writers, directors, actors. It was headed by a woman named Hallie Flanagan, who was an educator, a professor up at Vassar. And she had a vision, not only would this put folks back to work, but it could sort of create a national theater. And this was one of the first big rollouts of this idea of a national theater that was low cost and accessible to everyone. It Can't Happen Here was adapted into a script, which was then performed simultaneously, so same day opening, in 18 different cities, 21 theaters in those 18 cities, on October 27th, 1936, just 1 week before the 1936 presidential election. Of those productions, one was in Spanish down in Tampa, two were in Italian in San Francisco and Newark, one was in Yiddish in New York, and there was a company in the Pacific Northwest that was all African-American and Black actors. What's interesting is that the Federal Theater Project was considered to be too political and was shut down by Congress several years later.
And that brings us really to where we are almost today. In 2016, a second play version is put together by Berkeley Rep. At that point in time, Tony Taccone was the artistic director of Berkeley Rep. We had just gone through a summer, a contentious summer of who was going to be the Republican nominee. Of course, there was a battle between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton for the Democratic nomination. And a lot of people started to notice that the reality TV star Donald Trump could very well be the Republican nominee for president that particular year. Tony Taccone had done his dissertation, his graduate school dissertation, on the Federal Theater Project. And he started to collaborate with director Lisa Peterson, who directed this live production in 2016. And he was also working with a writer named Bennett Cohen. They decided that they would look at this 36 version of the play that you just mentioned. They got through 3 scenes, I believe, and then said, unproducible. Let's do our own version. So they're on a very tight timeline to get this new play version up, rehearsed, and produced as live theater. And it turns out to be pretty wonderful. Obviously, the material in this piece, could it happen here? Could America become an authoritarian government, a fascist government, was on people's minds. And they wanted to think about it and talk about it. So that particular play version, as I said, was done live. And now they're doing a radio play version of that, since we're in a pandemic and can't congregate inside theaters. Do you want to tell them a little bit about this upcoming version that they're about to listen to?
Yes, I think it's a great echo of what they did back in 36. It's being presented across the country, so produced by Berkeley Rep, but presented by over 70 organizations, including Roundabout. It goes live on October 13th at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on YouTube. Many of the same cast members from that 2016 production are involved, but the role of Doremus Jessup, the main character, is played by the actor David Strathairn, which is really exciting. He was an Oscar nominee for Good Night and Good Luck, where he played another journalist, right? Edward R. Murrow.
Right. Yes, very well, in fact. Because Murrow was very idiosyncratic, and he captured all that. Yeah. I want to just wrap this up by encouraging everybody to vote. I think that's a no-brainer, but I'll say it anyway. Leah, are you voting in person or by mail?
I will be voting in person. I really like my poll workers, and I really like my polling place. How about you, Ted?
Well, my husband and I are going to vote by mail. We're obviously senior citizens. There's, a lot to consider in terms of social distancing. So we'll be mailing in our ballots. I wanted to also mention that there will be 2 community conversations around this particular piece. We really and truly would love for you to participate. They'll be happening on October 25th at 2 p.m. and 5 p.m. EST. This is an opportunity for you, our audience members, to talk about what you just heard, to wrestle with the themes of the piece, to wrestle with what's happening in our country. So many opportunities to express yourself and your ideas among other audience members, kind of like what we do in the theater when we have post-play discussions, but this time it will be done remotely. Leah, I think you have a quote that you thought might serve us well. These words are from Sinclair Lewis himself, correct?
Yes, and the character of Doremus Jessup. The sooner we discard this idea of solutions, the sooner we can get on with the messy work of democracy and staying true to our values and to our rights. So, take it from Sinclair Lewis, take it from us, make a plan to vote. If you need more information on voting in your state, voting in your area, whenweallvote.org is a great resource. Please visit it. Thank you so much, Ted. It was great to talk about this today.
It's always a pleasure, Leah. Your brain is fertile, and I love being in proximity to it.
I would say the same about you.
Okay, I'm glad to hear it. Bye.